Welcome, everyone, to the podcast of the Wizarding School for Composers. I'm your host, Dr. Joseph Soa, and as a composer and educator, I've seen firsthand the transformative power that the right tools and ideas can have for creative growth. Join us each episode as we demystify the craft of composition with accomplished guests and explore new approaches to enhance your creativity, productivity, and joy. Whether you're a seasoned composer or just starting out, this is the podcast for you. Let's get started. My guest today is Danny Ziemann. Danny Ziemann is a touring jazz bassist, educator, and author living in Vienna, Austria. He regularly tours throughout the US, Europe, and Asia with various jazz groups. He's also the lecturer of jazz ear training and solfege at the University of Music and Performing Arts Graz, and leads a private coaching group called the First Call Musician. When he's not teaching or playing, he perfects his latte art, builds microphones, or works in his private recording studio. Danny, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Joseph. So great to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. In preparation for this interview, I was listening to your performance of Body and Soul, and I gotta say, I just loved it. To begin with, that tune is just a classic. I mean, what a great tune, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. Thanks for checking it out.
Yeah, and your playing just felt so smooth and so expressive. And I thought that this would be the perfect place to start because when I think about the bass, Body and Soul is really just a great way to describe it. More than any other instrument, the bass is a full body instrument. When you're playing it, you are standing up, you're literally holding this human-sized thing in your arms. And so I'm curious, how is it that you got into playing the bass?
Oh, well, first off, the description you used I love it. I think I'm going to start using that. The body and soul description is spot on. So my introduction into the bass was actually, I started playing violin. I never really wanted to be a bass player. My aspirations when I was younger was to be a heavy metal guitarist. So I played violin in school, played heavy metal guitar on the side, and my middle school orchestra teacher asked me if I would switch to the bass from the violin. Originally, I said no, but then she's like, "Oh, well, your best friend is playing the bass." So I kind of reluctantly switched, and the rest was history. I didn't really have not any desire to play. I don't know if any kid is like really set on what they want to do at that age musically, but the switch worked, and yeah, I fell in love with it. Recently, I actually caught up with my middle school music teacher, and she told me that they needed smart kids to play the bass, and that's why she asked me. So I felt flattered 23 years later.
Even if it is 23 years later, it's always great to hear that kind of thing.
Of course, I felt not vindicated, but I was like, okay, I'm glad I was on the right path back then.
Absolutely. And so we're just going to skip over a whole bunch of history. And as a bassist now, you've had the opportunity to perform with renowned musicians and study under influential mentors. And so I'm curious, how is it that these experiences have shaped your musical style and your approach to playing the double bass?
This is such a great question. I think every great mentor and musician you work with or perform with leaves their thumbprint on you in a way. Sometimes it's based on what you work on directly with the music. Sometimes it's just the influence of their life and their personality, the wisdom they share. I've had some remarkable mentors. I mean, it really is too many to list. Going back to middle school and high school, one I can think of is Dr. Steve Schuin. He is a music educator at the high school level who just retired, received his doctorate in music education and composition studying with Sam Adler. And our entire high school experience was about ear training, and every student had to compose. Every student in the music department composed and had their music played at the concerts. Everyone improvised. There was no distinction between classical and jazz. We all did everything. And so to be around someone who thinks of music that way and is always putting themselves on the spot to try things, even if they are uncomfortable or maybe not in full command of what they're trying to demonstrate, but they're just doing it to be fearless and show students they can do the same thing. I mean, that's invaluable at that age. So I think of experiences like that, or working with my various bass mentors like Jeff Campbell at the Eastman School or Larry Grenadier. They've all taught me different things about how I learn, how to be fearless, how to hold myself to high standards, how to play with the highest level of expression. All of them have their thumbprints. I could go on and on, but I'll leave it at I'm very thankful to have had some great mentors who have all shaped me in different ways.
That's phenomenal. One word that stood out to me as you were explaining about the influence of these mentors that you had, you mentioned in connection with a couple of them, is this word fearless. Why do you think it's so important to become fearless as a musician?
There are a couple of reasons. There's a performance aspect, which being fearless maybe helps you shake the mindset of having to be perfect or having to have a perfect performance. And I think that being fearless allows you to think more about the music and less about yourself, right? So if you're going to be fearless, you're really devoted to serving the music as best you can. If you're playing in fear of perfection, then all you care about, or maybe not all you care about, but a lot of the focus is on, okay, what do people think of me? So there's that element, especially as a teacher. It's so important to be fearless because if you want your students to be fearless and vulnerable, how can you expect them to do that if you yourself are not willing to put yourself on the spot and demonstrate what you can do? And so I think it's important because it puts the emphasis on the music. It also normalizes making mistakes, which is what everybody does. And the more you can get past that, the easier it is to actually make the choices that you want to. And so everyone I've worked with was fearless, no ego, just committed to being human. And I think that really allows you to achieve your highest level of expression.
I think that's super inspiring. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm curious, this is, of course, a podcast primarily for composers. How do you think that translates into composing? Oftentimes, as composers, we're not doing this live. We're sitting at our desks or a coffee shop or wherever we are. How do you think we can take that kind of fearlessness into things when we don't have the audience immediately right there?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that the idea of being a fearless composer really resonates with also being a fearless improviser because composition and improvisation are so closely linked, right? It's just the amount of time that you have to make decisions in both situations. One of the things that can inhibit me when I'm improvising and also when I'm composing is just analysis paralysis. Too many options, not being able to let go of finding the quote unquote perfect idea 100% of the time. I feel maybe like 90% of the time I'm able to play exactly what I hear without a second thought. And then the remaining 10%, there's always like, should I do this or this? And I feel like there's a little bit of a hiccup in my ability to connect to what I want to play. And that is really just because I'm thinking too hard. I think when I compose, it's the same thing. I usually say I can get about a good 16 bars before I kind of hit 10 forks in the road. And I think for me, it's like I know what my roadblocks are, or I know what the potential potholes are. And so if I can anticipate that, then I can really just encourage myself to make a decision and not worry so much about what it is in the moment because there's always time to edit everything. Maybe with improvisation, a little bit less so. There's other ways we have to work on that. But I think it's, yeah, kind of anticipating where it's going to happen, where those roadblocks might happen, and then just encouraging myself to push past it because I know that I will always have a chance to revise or revisit later on.
Yeah, I do think that is one of the benefits of composing over improvisation. It's just you have the time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, what do you do for that? I'm curious. I'm sure you've developed tools to get past that. So, do you have anything that really works for you in those situations?
Great question. Thanks for asking. For me, one of the main things that it's helped is just recognizing that you can break this task down in a lot of different ways. One of the metaphors that I tell people all the time is that the composer sitting down to compose, if you wake up in the morning like, it's time to compose, that makes about as much sense as a farmer saying, it's time to farm. Like, there are all of these specific tasks that I do, whether it's now I'm writing a melody, or now I'm harmonizing this, or now I'm trying to create a specific texture, or now I'm trying to create tension to this particular event, or I'm trying to release some event. So if I'm able to have clarity on what the composing task is that I'm trying to do, I tend to find that lowers some of the temperature around, oh my goodness, am I doing a good job about this or not?
Yeah, absolutely. It helps that you are turning it into smaller tasks. So it's not just like, okay, time to get healthy. I'm going to go to the gym. What do I do? You know that the time you're devoting to composing, even if it's a small chunk, you know that it's going towards developing your compositional chops. I think it definitely makes it, at least mentally, less of a barrier to get into. And I think that's so helpful for practice too, just to know that like listening to music is practice or sitting down and transcribing for 10 minutes is practice. Mental practice is practice. It doesn't have to be one specific thing. And I love that for composing, making it, I'm going to write a melody, I'm going to do this, I'm going to check out this, I'll copy this part of the score over. It's like knowing that all of those things contribute to your abilities, I think is such a healthy way to get into it and develop the skill.
Yeah, that's the idea. For those who follow me in the wizarding school, this is something that I'm really big on, is how can we do music from this really healthy space where we got into this because we love it. And it'd sure be great if we could continue to love it rather than it being something that leads to anxiety or boredom or frustration or those sorts of things. Turning it back to you. So you tour all over the world playing double bass. You teach aural skills. How did you stumble into this combination of particular things and why do you love it?
So it's interesting. My introduction to aural skills actually started when I was a kid. So my first jazz bass teacher, a guy from Buffalo named Wayne Moose, he actually, I mean, he was my first bass teacher. He happened to be a jazz bassist. I started lessons privately when I was 10. And one of the first things he did was give me an ear training book called Jump Right In. And the principles were developed by Ed Gordon, who's kind of a famed researcher for music learning theory. Music learning theory is not a method, it's just a presentation of research. And then Jump Right In was the method that was actually designed using the principles of music learning theory. It's kind of funny. Every step of the way in my education, I was somehow influenced by music learning theory or people who worked with this. So Wayne taught me privately for 4 years, and I learned to play jazz and improvise and was working on my ears. Then I went to high school. My first high school music teacher, Dave Stringham, got a bachelor's and master's from Eastman, where the authors who wrote Jump Right In, they were also the professors of music education at Eastman. So I studied with Dave. Then I switched high schools, studied with Steve Shewan, who also went to Eastman. Then I went to Eastman for a degree in music education and jazz performance, and was exposed to more of the principles to ear training because the professors there, again, wrote one of the premier methods on it. Then started teaching and went back for my master's and continued studying. So for about a solid 20 years, had a very steady diet of solfege and aural skills, which was cool because in tandem with that, right, I was getting all the theory and all the methodology, but I was also playing. I was gigging when I was 16 and just kind of living this life outside of school where I continued to play and develop my chops. So the good thing is that ear training and being a musician go hand in hand, especially a jazz musician. So I was lucky to have that experience from a young age. And then I got a college teaching job when I was 22 and I was teaching private bass lessons. All of the students that I worked with had minimal exposure to ear training. And I realized that so many of the problems that they were having technically with intonation, with sight reading, with learning repertoire, all of it was really stemming from a lack of exposure to aural skills. And I was basically able to take the knowledge that I learned in school and from my upbringing, but also apply it from the perspective of what one needs to be a working musician, which I understand is not the outcome for everybody, but it's kind of a non-academic perspective that I can bring into the mix. And really, like from the whole time I've been teaching, even until now, I've seen the need for it regardless of genre. And in the scope of what teachers offer, especially bass teachers, my gosh, there is such a huge emphasis on technique and what people can do and demonstrate with the instrument. And I kind of don't care so much about that. I really care about what people can demonstrate without the instrument. What can they do away from it? What kind of musicianship skills do they possess that does not require an instrument to demonstrate what they can do? And I think that's one of the powerful elements of ear training, is that when you actually develop those skills, the instrument is just confirmation of what you're already hearing or what you're already able to do. And that's really empowering. And I think that's something that not a lot of teachers teach. And so by recognizing I may be one of the few or only people who ever brings this topic up in a studying musician's life, or amateur musician or hobbyist or whatever, I feel it's my duty in a way to present these topics for whatever time I get to work with the students.
Yeah, for most of us, if you are studying music in a college or a conservatory in the 21st century, you're probably going to get 4 semesters of ear training,
Yeah.
and that's it. And a lot of the time, the ear training that you're going to receive is taught by a grad student. So it's like you're not even getting good ear training. You're just getting like yeah, this is your close enough approximation of what ear training might be. So the question that I'd ask is, why is it that strong listening skills contribute to becoming a competitive musician?
There's the practical reasons, like if you can't hear what's going on, at best, you're guessing how to participate in a musical experience, which sounds harsh, but it's kind of true. It's like being a chef and not knowing what the spices taste like. Like, oh yeah, paprika, like I'll put that in there. I don't know what it does, but yeah, I'm just following the recipe. And that's kind of what we end up doing, right? If we don't hear what's going on and we're just playing the notes on the page, we're following the recipe, but we don't actually know why things happen or how the flavors mix. And we also can't tell if we're actually hitting the mark or not. So there's that part of it where, again, it's harsh, but it's like at best we're guessing about how well we're really doing. And developing those skills will absolutely put anybody in an advantageous place. If you have killer ears and not just perfect pitch, being able to play something and hear how well you're blending with the ensemble, to hear the function of what you're playing, to have the confidence to sight read anything because you know what it's going to sound like before you even play it, or to look at a melody and be able to hear the chord changes in your head, even if there are none written, and use that to influence how you phrase. I mean, it's not even just how you demonstrate that on your instrument, but also the confidence that comes from knowing you can do that really empowers you to feel like you can play in any situation, even if it's with people you've never played with before. In a new situation, you're sight reading a concert at Carnegie Hall, or you're on stage in a country that's 10,000 miles away playing tunes you've never played before after not sleeping for 25 hours, which is a true story. It happened to me going to Singapore. I mean, this is regular for me, playing music I've never heard before without any music. And I just have to literally play it in the exact moment that the song is happening. I have to be like one beat ahead of everybody. The confidence to do that makes me feel like there are no surprises that will really shock me. And that allows me to be more in the moment and more reliable because I can base my confidence on that. That's kind of the pragmatic. The other part is sort of the woo-woo thing, which is that your training is the glue that fills in all the cracks of musicianship. Everyone inevitably hits a wall at some point or hits a plateau. And I think this is something that can always help us push to the next level, especially because there are some major plateaus that every musician will get through. And going back and filling in the gaps with some of the basics, like hearing 1, 4, and 5, or being able to learn simple melodies by ear, it's like that always helps people push forward. I don't know why, just kind of how it is, at least from what I've seen and what I've experienced. So yeah, it kind of does it all. It almost sounds too good to be true, but it's not.
Yeah, no, that sounds incredible. And what you're describing with going to Singapore and that experience that you mentioned, it almost sounds like a superpower. Certainly for a non-musician, the story that you described is just like, this is amazing. I know a normal person could do that. But even for a lot of musicians, they would probably still feel, this is amazing. No normal musician could do that. And so I actually want to back up just a little bit and just say, okay, we've been talking a lot about ear training, and I'm sure that a lot of people in the audience know what we mean by that. But I'm curious, what do you mean by that? When you're thinking about ear training, what are the building blocks that you need to say, okay, I have mastered my basics of ear training? And what are these pieces doing to support each other?
Yeah. So everyone's definition is different. It largely depends on what music you're ultimately going to be playing. If you're playing, Berg's music exclusively, like in Vienna, in a third Viennese school ensemble, then this is probably not going to fit your definition. But for the most part, what I'm thinking about with ear training is functional listening skills. So my benchmark is ultimately I want to be able to hear a piece of music, let's say like a basic song, could be a jazz tune, like 32 bars, AABA form, or a basic pop song, or maybe a Beatles song. I want to be able to hear it once or twice. And after the completion of the second listen, I want to know all of the chord changes. I want to know what they are functionally. I want to be able to pick up my instrument and play along. I would like to be able to improvise over those chord changes, maybe make up a new melody. So that's my benchmark for harmony. Otherwise, being able to listen to a melody that does not have chord changes and be able to imagine what the chord changes are based on what the functions of the melodic notes are. I want to be able to look at a piece of music I've never played before and without my instrument be able to sing it in my head and actually make sense of what's going on and have a sort of kinesthetic reaction to my fingers. So to be able to feel the movement and the sound, even if the instrument's not there. So you'll notice that I didn't say like, I want to hear all my intervals or I want to be able to hear which inversion of a secondary dominant. Like, yes, I can do those things. And I teach my students to hear chromatic harmony and really dense 5 or 6 note voicings with chromatic alterations. Like, yeah, that stuff is also extremely valuable. But it's functional. I want to be able to hear key changes. I want to know what they are. I want to hear harmony and not be shocked when I hear something that I'm not expecting. So to be able to listen along as if I'm looking at the score, but without needing it, and having that same level of confidence with hearing harmony and hearing melodic shape.
What I find so interesting about your approach is it feels like you're helping students see the forest for the trees, right? If you go to a lot of your training websites or if you look at college curricula, it's like you are learning how to sing intervals, you're learning how to identify chord qualities. And yeah, these things are definitely important, but to be able to say, okay, well, why do we care about these things? We care about it because if I can hear this tune and just know the changes after one or two listenings, then now I can begin to improvise along to it. Or if I can look at a melody and I know the harmony by just by looking at the melody, well, in many ways, it really reduces the load that I have as a composer. I'm thinking about this for me specifically. Like when I look at a melody and I'm just like, oh yeah, this is the harmony that's being implied. It's kind of like the difference between like when you're reading, right? When you start, you're sounding out every letter and trying to figure out like that. But as you get better at reading, it's like you're reading in terms of words, sentences. In fact, you can just skim over entire paragraphs. And it sounds like you're after a similar sort of fluency in music.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, you nailed the analogy that I use, which is focusing on letters. Yeah, when we first start off, we definitely do that. But even with children, they are mimicking phrasing before they can actually speak. And by the time a child is 5, they know something like over 10,000 words. So there's the power to learning music by listening first, even before reading. I mean, the way that we learn language is we listen, then we speak, and then we read, and then we write. And usually in music learning, it's the opposite, right? We start with reading, then speaking, and then maybe we get to listening. And very seldomly do we get into composing or writing. And so with music, by focusing on intervals first or recognizing chords, I mean, yeah, learning to recognize intervals and then trying to find that in music is like learning to pronounce cat by saying, okay, C A T, seat. Like it doesn't work because you don't hear it in that context. And as you said, in fact, like the basic unit that we listen to is a sentence, and that's like a phrase. That's like a 251 or a 14251, for example. Like that's a complete harmonic or melodic statement. And I think starting with intervals and recognizing chords, yeah, it can be cool, but there's two things. One, if we can recognize a fifth, but we can't recognize C dominant going to F major, then that's a problem for me. Right? That's a fifth, but in a context that we're not exposed to in just interval studies. The other thing is starting with intervals and smaller chunks assumes that we don't really have the attention span to actually focus on more music. And it's using these non-musical building blocks to learn to make music when, I mean, children sing songs, right? Like children are singing songs when they're 2 or 3. Like adults can do that. We don't need intervals or baby steps to make music. We can just do it right away. And I guarantee if you teach someone just through rote with actual songs, if you ask them to sing in intervals 6 months down the line, they'll be able to sing all their intervals, even if they didn't work on them. So it's using music as the repertoire and music as the main motivator. And I mean, that's how people did it for centuries. That's how music was learned before there was even established pedagogy, just orally.
Again, I want to tie this back to composers of what does this have to do with composers? I want to give you a little bit of context on this. For many composers, and you can probably relate to this, many composers think of writing music kind of like taking internal dictation. Like you have this radio in your head and you're just like, oh, I'm just going to write down what the radio in my head is playing, right? But for many composers, that's often not the case as well. And particularly in the 21st century, it's so easy to remix existing music. And with the rise of AI tools, you can literally create entire songs just with a few verbal prompts without knowing the intervals, chord scales, or rhythms that make them happen. And so, in the context of these sorts of things, I'm curious, why do you feel like good oral skills are important for composers?
Yeah, there are always going to be tools that we can use to make our lives easier. I'm in the recording space doing a lot of mixing and mastering, and now there are like AI tools that will mix songs for you or like master songs for you. And it's amazing, but I think ultimately those tools are best served when you actually have an idea of what you want it to sound like in the first place. So it's an assistive tool, not a full replacement. So oral skills for composers, even if there are other tools out there that can generate music for you, I think there are a couple pieces to it. One is I think you will be more satisfied with the end result if you know exactly what you want to get out of these tools and how you can alter the feedback in order to get something closer. I think there's also something about investing in the journey of being a musician, just spending the time working on these skills and not treating it like an iPhone app where you get instant access to everything. I think there's something that's really humbling about the experience of going down the road and working on these skills as a means of bettering your musicianship. Just like there are no quick fixes to being healthy, there are no quick fixes to working on fitness or mental health or developing any other major skills. It's an investment of time. And if you want to not just be good at it, but you really want to make something you're proud of, it's going to take that investment. Other pieces of it, I think, just like with jazz music, so many musicians want to be innovative. This might strike a no pun intended, this might strike a chord with some people. A lot of musicians want to be innovative, right? And innovation is not just from creating something new that's never been done before. It's like language. Never in history, except for maybe like Klingon, has someone created a language that other people have just learned to understand. And I think that if you want to create something innovative, you have to come from somewhere that's been established and have an idea about what direction you want to go into. And I think it's the same for lots of styles of music. It's like paying respect to the past, but also having a vision for what you want to do in the future. And having good aural skills allows you to really recognize what's happened in the past and synthesize that in a way that you can use it and translate it through your experiences and allow you to push forward. I think it's actually one of the easiest ways because not only can you learn things quicker, but you also develop a system for organizing what you hear. And also you can give adjectives and descriptors to what you hear in a way that makes sense to you. So then you can not just communicate that with others, but you can also draw from that internal toolbox to influence your writing. I think it's the fastest way to actually be able to do that. I'm not a studied composer by any means, but at least in terms of improvisation, definitely that seems to be the case.
I would affirm that. As a studied composer, your ears are definitely your best asset. Whether or not you are taking dictation like you're doing it from the radio, or you're generating music using different rules or systems, or you're remixing it, whatever your approach is to composing, having an idea of this is roughly the sound that I want, or even specifically the sound that I want, it definitely makes it a lot easier.
Yeah. And there's really no other way you can replace that experience. But also, the path of working on your ears actually makes everything happen faster. This is something I tell my students too. Without giving away too much, I was getting a little bit of pushback in one of my ensembles recently because I'm making all my students learn tunes by ear. And they had a week to learn one tune, and some of them didn't do it. And I was like, guys, yeah, it maybe takes you a week to learn a tune now, but eventually it'll take you 10 minutes. Like you do the work now because it will get easier. The better your ears get, you get to a point of fluency where the stuff just happens so much faster and it's not a drag. It doesn't take 10 hours to get your ideas out or to remember these things. So it's an investment in efficiency as well. And it's a gift that keeps on giving. The more you work on it, the faster and faster you get until it's just second nature.
Absolutely. That's definitely been my experience. And speaking to some of our more seasoned listeners, the transition that I've had to go through, and I'm curious if you had a similar transition, Danny, was that I got so used to really struggling with things because when you're starting out, everything is a struggle, right? It's all hard. That there came a point where I had to realize that, you know what? I'm actually good at this. And in some of these areas, I'm actually really good at this. And so shifting the attitude around in my head of how hard should this be? Well, yeah, some of these skills that I was doing were hard, but they are no longer hard. So did you ever have to go through that transition yourself? And what advice would you give for someone that is on the cusp of making that transition?
Yeah, I love this question. I definitely have gone through that shift in my head. Part of it is listening to what other people say and just taking in external proof about me being able to do this. So, like my ears in college, I always felt like I was the slowest person. Everyone around me had technique that was miles ahead of where I was. They knew all these crazy tunes, they knew all these great musicians, and I felt like I was the slowest person to develop the skills I needed to play. And then when I graduated, I got this gig touring with Gordon Webster, the guy that I traveled all over the world with. And as I said, we would just show up to gigs and he's like, we're going to do You Turn the Tables on Me. And then he would just start playing. And spoiler, I do have perfect pitch. I did not always have perfect pitch. It came later on in life. But he knew that I had good ears. And so he would test me. Like sometimes he wouldn't even announce the tunes. He would just play a short 4-bar intro and then go. And I was like, okay, challenge accepted. Let's do this. And I probably learned like 200 or 300 tunes that way. So in the beginning, I was like, wow, can I really do this? Do I deserve to be up here? Can I really make this happen? And then after a while, I was like, okay, yeah, he keeps on calling me because he knows I can do this. I'm doing these gigs where there's no music because he knows I can hang on. And so that was the proof that was externalized that I started to believe. It was just there in front of me. And I started to live with it and then recognize, yeah, I can totally do these things. If there's one thing that makes other musicians really uncomfortable, I think it's this humility that stretches so far that you become self deprecating. I think we all know these people where it's like, hey, this sounded really great. They're like, oh, yeah, but this didn't work so well, and I haven't been practicing so much lately, and I don't feel so good. And it makes everyone else very uncomfortable. And I realized for a while I was doing that because I couldn't handle a compliment. And that was making me believe less in what I could do. And when I stopped doing that and just looked at the proof ahead of me, it's like, okay, I can do this. And I do believe in it. And I lean into those skills a lot. I think it's not you being egotistical, it's just a fact. I can rely on my ears and they work for me. And that's the truth. So I think it's looking for reassurance from other people or other areas if you need it, and just thinking, okay, why do I not believe in these skills? Is it because I really don't think I can do it? Or am I just so humble that I'm afraid to take a compliment and that gets turned too far?
Thank you for sharing your story in that. As you were explaining what was happening for you, it's like, yeah, I can definitely relate to this is the thing that had to happen. I needed to start noticing, and particularly with support from trusted friends and mentors, it's like, no, actually, I am a really good composer. I can do this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I heard at least a couple of different things that if we had more time, I would love to follow up on. You mentioned that you developed perfect pitch. I mean, some musicians don't think that's possible. There are at least two or three other things that if I give it some thought, it's like, man, these are lots of different conversations that I'd love to have. But what I find inspiring is now that you've gone through the process, you've put in the work, you have learned these aural skills, you're now turning around and trying to help other musicians develop this as well. And one of the ways that you're doing this is through your program, The First Called Musician. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that and how it is that people could be involved in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for asking about that.
Yeah.
So, this is the latest expansion of my private coaching program. The last 3 years, I've held the First Call Bassist, which is was my 6 month program. Now it's 9 month program. And in those programs, I was working on developing the skills that we talked about, being able to listen to a tune once and know all of the chord changes, to be able to play with total musical freedom, and to be able to play with the best musicians around anywhere and not be worried about sounding bad or not knowing tunes. Over the last few years, I've worked a lot with, I say non-bassists to describe every other musician and instrumentalist who's out there. I've been working with them to help them develop these skills as well, because I'm realizing that oftentimes, as you said, people get at most 4 semesters of aural skills in college, and they leave not having the tools that they need. I mean, this is a big blanket statement, but oftentimes they leave without being able to relate to the skills that they learned in a way where they can use it in their performance settings. So I have expanded to teach all instrumentalists, and the upcoming program, it's a 9 month program starting at the end of September. And it just dives into all these skills we've talked about. So being able to hear basic harmony to very advanced chromatic harmony, being able to improvise, compose some basic songs and basic forms, definitely not at the level that you're doing, but using composition as a tool to work on aural skills. And we do it through a variety of different types of repertoire. And yeah, it's just super fun. Like, we start at the basics, hearing 1 and 5, and get to the point where we are solfeging chromatic key changes and transcribing Miles Davis solos by ear and listening to symphonies and all different types of music, just to really get inside of it and see, like, okay, how much can we recognize away from our instruments? So we meet twice a week. I do a lecture on Mondays, and I have a full-time coach who works on Thursdays to do small group practice sessions to facilitate those, guided practice sessions, and also really healthy goal setting. And everyone walks away with a complete set of tools that they can use to, again, work on solfege, really develop their harmonic listening chops. I've got hundreds of pages of handouts and all these supplemental materials. So it's like my dream way of being able to teach this. And I also do work at a university. I teach all these skills too, but this is my own world. I can design everything I want to from the ground up without any limitations. So it's my dream way of helping people develop their listening skills, again, regardless of instrument and regardless of genre.
That's so awesome. In many ways, it feels like an opportunity for musicians or composers. Like, this is the graduate school ear training that you wish you had.
Yeah, it's funny because it's definitely the advanced ear training. And in some ways, it's advanced because it goes to such a simple level that it's almost like ripping the rug out from beneath your feet. You're like, oh, wait a second. What does a five chord sound like again? Like, how do I hear these basic things? And I used to be surprised by this, but now I expect it. So many musicians I work with, even ones who are playing at the highest level, getting the top gigs with top performing artists or top orchestras, some people can't hear one, four, and five easily. And it's not anything to be embarrassed about. It's just that's actually quite difficult for a lot of people to hear the difference between a four chord and an inversion of a two chord, or to hear four minor, four, one. All these things that are theoretically are relatively elementary. But listening wise, it's like, yeah, to go back and fill in some of those basic gaps actually can take the most amount of work. And that's, I think, where a lot of the enlightenment comes in. Once you can figure out how to do those things, it opens up all these possibilities and allows you to actually get past those blockages that a lot of advanced musicians have now. It's like the key to hearing chromatic harmony is hearing the simplest diatonic harmony. But oftentimes, we don't get the opportunity to do that because music education is about, okay, we want you to sound as advanced as possible, as quickly as possible. So
Mhm.
you are rather one really, kind of skates past a lot of things that they should be working on because it's more about the presentation of skill. And so it's like these things, hearing basic harmony gets left by the wayside all the way to even top careers and not really given the opportunity to go back and work on those things.
I think it's great that you give musicians an opportunity to go back and work on those things. Well, we're coming up just about at the end of our time, and I just want to thank you again for coming and sharing your expertise and sharing all of the motivating and really interesting ways that you have of talking about aural skills. I think that's fantastic. If people want to learn more about you or the First Call Musician, where should they go to find out about that?
Yeah, so they can go to either firstcallmusician.com, and I have right now it's just open for the waiting list, but they can sign up there to get more information about it, or dannyziemann.com, and they'll find more information there.
Okay, that's awesome. Thanks so much, Danny. Well, we're at final thoughts point. Just to sum up this conversation, do you have any last thoughts that you want to share with the audience? Any
Yeah,
words?
yeah, and thank you again for, by the way, asking such thoughtful questions. It's been awesome to be here. And I think my final summation would be just be fearless. I mean, that's incredibly hard to be fearless, but really, if there's an opportunity to take a harder path to learning something, like you want to learn a new tune, avoid the urge to look at sheet music just yet and see how much you can do away from it. Like anytime there's an opportunity to do something that may be a bit harder, but stretches your musicianship a bit more, I'd say go for it. And I would encourage everyone to try one fearless act of music making a day. Like, what can you do where you're vulnerable, but you're just going to go for it? Because I think that will absolutely lead to not just better listening chops, but just more fulfillment and more fun in music. Because ultimately, I believe the reason that we participate in music and make music is because it's fun and we love it. And that's, for me, the whole purpose. Like, if I can get people to love music more, then my job is complete. So, whatever we can do to make that happen, or whatever someone who's listening to this can do to make that happen every day, that's what I wish for them.
Awesome. Well, listeners out there, this is your assignment. Go do one thing that's fearless that helps you have fun and other people with music. Anyway, thanks again, Danny, for being here. And it was a pleasure, and we will see you later.
Awesome. Thanks, Joseph.
All right, bye.